The Obama administration has made opening more charter schools one of its top priorities in its plans to improve the nation's education system. On Monday, Education Secretary Arne Duncan spoke at the annual gathering of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools in Washington, D.C.
So I'm a big supporter of these successful charter schools, and so is the President. And that's why one of our top priorities is a $52 million increase in charter school funding for our FY 2010 budget.
Duncan is pushing aggressively to expand the number of charter schools around the country, and the Obama administration has been working to persuade state legislators to lift caps on the number of charter schools. According to Education Department figures, there are currently some 4,600 charter schools operating around the country. They now educate some 1.4 million of the nation's 50 million public school students. The schools are financed with taxpayer money but operate free of many curricular requirements and other regulations that apply to traditional public schools. In his remarks on Monday, Education Secretary Duncan also addressed some criticisms of charter schools as anti-union and pro-privatization.
We also need to work together to help people better understand charters. Many people equate charters with privatization, and part of the problem is that some charters overtly separate themselves from the surrounding district. This is why opponents often say that charters take money away from public schools, and we all know that's absolutely misleading. Charter schools are public schools serving our children with our money. Instead of standing apart, charters should be partnering with districts, sharing lessons and sharing credit. Charters are supposed to be laboratories of innovation that we can all learn from. And charters are not inherently anti-union. Albert Shanker, the legendary former head of the AFT, was an early advocate. Many quality charters today actually are unionized. What distinguishes great charters is not the absence of a labor agreement, but the presence of an educational strategy built around common sense ideas, more time on task, aligned curricula, high parent involvement, great teacher support, and strong leadership.
The gathering, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, came on the heels of a new report by Stanford University's Center for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO. The report found that, on average, students in charter schools were not faring as well as students in traditional public schools. In his address, Education Secretary Duncan addressed the findings of the report and said that only high-quality charters should be allowed to operate.
The CREDO report last week was absolutely a wake-up call, even if you dispute some of its conclusions or its language. The charter movement is putting itself at risk by allowing too many second-rate and even third-rate schools to continue to exist. Your goal should always be quality, not quantity. Charter authorizers need to do a better job of holding schools accountable, and the charter schools need to support them loudly and sincerely. I absolutely applaud the work that the Alliance is doing with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers to strengthen academic and operational quality. We need that. We also need to be willing to hold low-performing charters accountable.
Education Secretary Arne Duncan speaking in Washington, D.C. Well, among those who also addressed the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools yesterday was the lead author of that Stanford University report, Kenneth Surratt. He is Assistant Director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford. He joins us also from Washington, D.C. And we're joined by Bob Peterson, the founding editor of Rethinking Schools. He teaches fifth grade at a public school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, co-editor of the book Keeping the Promise, The Debate Over Charter Schools. Joining us from Milwaukee, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! Kenneth Surratt, let's begin with you. Your major findings in this report.
The major finding is that, on average, charter school students in the 16 states that we looked at are performing a little bit below their traditional public school peers.
And Bob Peterson, could you expand on that? Because that is definitely going against the grain of what most charter school, the charter school movement is telling the public.
Yeah, I think it's really important to see that on page 32 of their report, they reported that Black and Hispanic students scored significantly lower in charter schools, significantly lower than their counterparts in public schools. That's in math and reading. I mean, there's good charter schools and there's bad charter schools, just like there's good public schools and bad public schools. The question is whether or not charter schools can be an engine for reform of public education. Obama and Duncan seem to think so. I completely disagree.
Kenneth Surratt, this report that you came out with, it was more being framed by Arne Duncan that there are some problem schools. But the fact that your report found that, on average, kids in these schools across the country are doing worse, isn't this a major blow to the charter school movement?
I don't think so. One of the findings, we looked at over 2,400 schools within our study, and on average, we did what we call a quality curve, and 46% of the charter schools are doing statistically insignificant differently than their traditional public school peers. 17% are outperforming, but the sobering part is that 37% are underperforming compared to their peers. But you know, what we feel is that charters, once they get back to this focus of the trade-off that they had for flexibility, for accountability, you know, and closing those underperforming schools and finding ways to replicate the higher performing ones, the movement could continue to grow.
Kenneth Surratt, I'd like to ask you about the mix of schools that you analyzed. I know you had numerous states, but it's been my experience, at least with the charter school movement here in New York City, that most charter schools start out at the lowest grades. There are some high school, but most start out at kindergarten first and second and then build up. And those are generally the easiest grades to deal with. Not as many start at the intermediate or high school level, where you could really gauge whether a genuine substantive progress is being made. What is in your study, what was the mix between primary, intermediate, and high schools that you looked at across the country?
You know, I don't have an exact breakdown of the number of schools in each one of those, but what made our analysis we did look at performance at elementary, middle, high school, and multi-level schools, and found that actually elementary and middle schools were actually outperforming their traditional public school peers. The measure that we use is growth on their each state's test, and because testing is generally from 3rd to 8th grade, so we can't even really look at the schools who just have kindergarten through 3rd grade, because we haven't gotten a growth score on those yet.
Bob Peterson, talk overall about the growth of the public charter school movement, where it's come from, who's behind it, and then how you're organizing with public school teachers around the country.
Yeah, this charter school movement started, I think, with very well-intended individuals who wanted to be free from what they considered bureaucracy and some rigid union contracts. And that their core beliefs or their assumptions were that once they had that freedom, they would increase academic achievement, and that they would be innovative, and that furthermore, that those lessons would be shared with the public schools. That just hasn't been the case. There's no state or district where charter school policies have really been transformative in that way. And that, in fact, is why we need a public education. In a democracy, we have to service all kids. And oftentimes we find in charter schools there's some picking and selecting of children through rigorous or complicated application forms and so on and so forth. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that while the charter school movement includes some very well-intended individuals and some quality schools, it's also become a favorite of conservative forces and conservative foundations that have really championed charterizing and the marketizing, as I say, the whole public sphere of public education. And so they would like to see more private control of schools, less union, quote, interference. And it's a very disconcerting problem, because those of us who have the interests of all kids at heart know that there's inherent problems in a market solution. And so what we really need to do is to challenge this notion that the charters are the engine of reform. There are a lot of different ways that schools can be reformed. There's no silver bullet, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not the charter movement, which apparently Obama and Duncan have seen fit to say is the